In order for autonomous vehicles to be accepted, do we need them to be as safe as human drivers, or do we need them to be way, way safer? And if it's the latter, what are the implications of that for Tesla and their ambitions?
I don't know how you are going to make something safe enough that a mother with a child is going to feel comfortable handing over control. I don't know how you create that feeling.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Leah Mahtani.
Hi, I'm Emil Michael.
In today's episode of Reacts, we are covering the R1 and Humane AI launch disasters. What does it mean for an autonomous vehicle to be safe enough? The TikTok ban has been passed into law, FTC in the US has ended non-competes, and Google has fired people who have been protesting against their connections with Israel in the context of the Gaza war. Looking forward to jumping into this one. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off. Today we have a new guest co-host. Leah Mahtani is joining us. Leah, welcome to the show. Maybe tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Yaniv. I'm an old friend of Chris's and a new friend of yours, which is exciting. This is actually my second time. I think the first time you were away on holiday.
Oh, of course.
And I had Chris. And so maybe at some point I'll get both of you on together versus just one of you. I'm all things product marketing. And so between you, Chris, and I, we're the dream squad, the product, the tech guy, and product marketer.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us again. This is your first time on Reacts and can't wait to get into all of those topics with you. So we've had a couple of AI-powered hardware devices that have been released lately. So the Rabbit AI device and the Humane AI pin. And this has become an interesting story because both of them were quite panned in the reviews. And there's particularly a guy on YouTube, Marcus Brownlee, who has a massive, massive following as a kind of tech product reviewer. And he basically successively said these are the two worst products he's ever reviewed. And that created a bit of a controversy as well, of people saying, he shouldn't have done that. That's too harsh. At least they're having a go. And I thought this was a really interesting thing to see because these are both very ambitious companies. They've released these products that are seemingly not ready for prime time. And in software, we say, you should launch early and iterate. And if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your device, you've waited too long. But I wonder if the same applies to hardware. And what's your folks' analysis of this situation?
Lee, you're the newcomer, so you go first.
Sure. So as a product marketer, watching people launch products is fascinating to me. You get a little bit of that schadenfreude, you get a little bit of the opposite where you get utter delight in them doing really well. When I reflected on Rabbit versus Humane, what was interesting was the Humane tone. The AI pin felt very somber, monochromatic. The tonality was very low, almost like a deep baritone. When you were trying to think about the use cases, it felt like as if they were trying to save you from your phone. Whereas when you look at the Rabbit, it really felt very joyful, very bright. The physical hardware itself felt like a representation of exploration. And so I think there's almost going to be more tolerance for something that's attempting to try and find its way and feel like fun to use and fun to explore with the Rabbit than with the Humane pin. There's going to be less tolerance for that not being quite ready.
I was kind of coming at it from a higher level insofar as this reviewer is well regarded. He was trying the devices out as a consumer might, not as a tech optimist, early adopter, like the people who stand online for the Vision Pro. And in some ways you're like, well, that feels like a mistake if you're very early in your product cycle to be having someone review this from a very consumer perspective. Because as we all know, the combination of hardware software products takes years to refine. like a very long time refining a complex device, especially one that's connected to the internet and an LLM and all this stuff. So to the extent that companies had a hand in saying, like, hey, we want you to review our product, just say, that's probably a mistake. That all being said, these devices get better. It's just hard when you get bad reviews in your startup and you're trying to raise money and investors see all this. So hardware for small companies, it's been said 1,000 times, is not easy. It's just not.
To me, a lot of this is about positioning the product in the market. And to your point, Emil, it's like, okay, why is this worse for hardware than for software? First of all, you're kind of stuck with the hardware you've got. Second of all, it's quite expensive. These are devices that cost in the sort of high hundreds of dollars. I think the Humane Pin, at least, also required a monthly subscription. So you're asking people to pay real money for something that's not necessarily quite useful yet. And I remember back in the day, I think when Google was doing Glass, and I think this was true for a couple of other things, they were selling these things on the open market, but they were calling them developer previews. And so again, that was a positioning thing. It was saying, look, you can buy this thing, but we're not promising you'll love it. To your point, Emil, I'm not sure that this reviewer was actually asked to review the device. He may have done it off his own bat. But if you're in the market, like the beauty of capitalism, right, is it's brutal. You have to earn your sales. And if you've gone out with a product that is simply not ready, then you're not going to earn your sales. And, you're right maybe to mention the Vision Pro as well. Again, another very expensive device that is amazing and it's probably the future, but is it quite ready to use? And apparently there have been very high return rates on those things. So how should you position something like this? Because it's true, your first version might not be particularly great. And you need it out in the market to get that feedback and that iteration. But how do you make sure that people don't buy this thing and then come away really disappointed and kind of burn your reputation?
Well, I read that the rabbit, they designed it in 10 minutes, drawing it out on a piece of paper, and that was the entire design cycle. So I think there's something to be said for taking things to consumers, getting them to play around with models, getting them to touch them, feel them. There was probably a middle ground between 10-minute back of the napkin and 5 years worth of deep, probably diminishing precision, diminishing return on research. There's somewhere in between that both of them probably could have had. In terms of how you position it, you probably got to think about who you're putting it out there for. So are you looking for a small group of highly interested, highly tolerant people who just want to play and explore and try something out? Are you looking for mass adoption? I think you've really got to be clear on what you're looking for and then be able to have an upfront conversation with the consumer. There's nothing people like than being involved in a secret club. Why we couldn't create some secret clubs to try out some really interesting hardware. I'm pretty sure, Yaniv, you'd love to be on the list for trying something out that's not quite ready yet. A few years ago, about 10 years ago, I think, I bought a good friend of mine a smartwatch, and I won't say the brand. I wrote a note in there to say, this isn't ready yet, but you'll have fun playing around, because I know that person doesn't want to play with things when they're already set and locked down. This is someone who wants to try things and see them fail and work out the edges. So if you're someone like that, I don't know why these hardware companies wouldn't try and find their community like that and bring them on the journey. And then you get a review that's full of empathy and full of wonder and full of guidance for you versus being slammed because you probably potentially didn't have the humility to go on the journey.
One other lens for this is it's to do with how much money these companies raised. Humane raised $240 million. Rabbit raised less, but still a lot. They raised $36 million. And so straight away, they did that. And then they also did a lot of this sort of pre-announcement and hype building. My suspicion is they had so much pressure to start to deliver growth that they went broad with a product that wasn't ready to go broad. And when you think about how these sort of cult hardware things sort of start, they're usually semi-bootstrapped, maybe crowdfunded or whatever. And you can reach out to the hobbyists and you can be like, hey, we're doing this cool little gonzo thing and it's for tinkerers. Like you think about like the Raspberry Pi or something like that. They didn't do these like slick presentations and do a 6-month pre-announcement. They're like, we're for hobbyists, right? And they didn't have this massive venture capital behind them so they could do that. But when you've raised $250 million and then you launch your hardware device, you can't just sell 500 units. And so I wonder to what extent, this is the fault of the funding structure that's simply not appropriate for this type of consumer hardware device.
It's a hard, I've been involved in so many hardware businesses. The reason why it's hard is because Apple can withstand the total failure of Vision Pro. and spend a ton more R&D on it and relaunch it in a year and relaunch it in a year and take all the returns, and they just can withstand that. And so if you're a small hardware company, you're like, I better raise money because I have to withstand that. Because if you can't, then you're kind of in trouble. So I don't really know what the answer is. Maybe the answer is when you launch your device, it has to at least do one thing extraordinarily well. So your market like, hey, other things are improving, but it does this one thing extraordinarily well. Judge us on that. Not everything else, because everything else is going to improve. So it's like setting expectations, calling it a beta, who do you sell it to, what are you saying it does, and then drawing the potential. But when you go out there and saying, hey, this is an AI pin that does everything, it's your personal agent for life, well, the expectations are going to be pretty high on that. So the money structure, I just think they need it. How else do you succeed? What other hardware product has succeeded at mass scale in the last 10 years from a startup?
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair question. I'm not sure. It's a tough game, right? But it's also maybe a question of when you raise. Like, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. And we talk a lot on the podcast. I know Chris is probably listening to this, wishing he was here, because he talks about doing that embarrassingly narrow thing. Like, what's this one thing you do really well? Both of these devices do a bunch of stuff badly and have positioned themselves as being a sort of everything device. I think that's really bad. But I guess I feel like when you've raised that much money, and then you've waited a long time to launch, and then your first launch is still not ready, you're kind of screwed, right? So the idea of venture funding is generally you raise some money, you de-risk, you learn something, then you raise more money and so on, right? And it's like, why didn't they have a version of this hardware that didn't cost $250 million to make, maybe cost 10 million, and then get some user feedback so that by the time they've raised this much money, they're on version 3 and it doesn't suck anymore. They've gone for the big bang launch and it's not ready. So it's like the worst of all possible worlds. And I think strategically they've made a bunch of mistakes in terms of just how startups operate.
Well, I think someone could have shown that piece of paper with a 10-minute drawing on it to someone and say, how does this feel? We've halved the size of the phone. We think we're going to have a tangible wheel that you can move up and down. Like, you could have walked that down the street and shown that to someone and got a sense of how it was at least going to land for them before you commit to all the hardware. And what was interesting was when they talked about, oh, we did a design cycle in 10 minutes. There's a point of pride in that. If you read like the interviews and listen, like there's actual pride in it took us 10 minutes and we feel we nailed it. Don't get me wrong, I think the design's beautiful. I think it's great to have people trying things, pushing the envelope. It's a shame that there was this leapfrogging of some really worthwhile work in between to get it really right for whatever that embarrassingly narrow use case is.
It's funny, I just wanted to join the dots backwards on Apple, which I think is maybe unfair, but interesting, right? So it's funny, in response to some of the critical tweets about this Rabbit R1 device, someone posted a photo of the Apple One, you know, the original Apple computer, which was like made out of wood and not in a factory by someone who's not very good at woodworking. And they said something like, you know, this thing isn't ready for prime time. And like, first of all, the Apple One was a useful device, unlike apparently the Rabbit. But the other thing about it is at the time, Apple had raised no venture capital. They only made, I think, 100 units. And that's sort of the point, right? So they could do this thing and then they could iterate. And by the time they were taking outside capital, they had a successful product. And then I was also thinking about the iPhone. Again, I don't know if this was part of Steve Jobs' master plan or if, again, it's just sort of joining the dots backwards. But the first version of the iPhone was actually the iPod, right? Again, to your point, Emil, iPod only did one thing, and it did it really well, which was play music. So by the time the iPhone came out, and remember, in the rumors before Steve Jobs' big announcement, people were calling it the iPod phone. So it's like you already had a hardware device from Apple that people understood and loved and did something really well. And then they were adding extra features to it. Now, it turns out, you know, the iPhone was even more incredibly capable than people expected, but it was actually not the first version of the personal hardware device from Apple. And yeah, I nearly wondered if the Vision Pro deviates from that playbook, and that's part of the issue with Apple. But yeah, generally the first version of a general purpose device is going to suck.
I think we've beaten this topic. I think it's unknowable. Like, you know, I have an Opal camera now and it's cool. A lot of people use it. And we had GoPros and that made a splash for a while, if you remember GoPro. And part of it is the buzz you create. So I understand why they want to produce a lot of this stuff as opposed to just doing a really small run and perfecting it forever. But I don't know. It's just a hard spot.
But they do find their people, right? Like the GoPros and divers and things like that. You can find your people who will take your hardware and help you make it better. And you find your niche and you find your spot. And hopefully these guys can do the same.
Right. So maybe the rabbit should have said, we're helping senior citizens who don't like complexity, and we're going to do these 3 things for senior citizens. They were going to like call their kids, extreme pictures, and I fell and I can't get up sensor. I don't know. And that's like your target market, just like GoPro is for divers and mountain climbers, and expand it for there. I guess I'm centering in on this, like doing a small number of things well for a small, passionate community, and then go from there.
It's funny you mentioned GoPro because, yes, we'll go into the next topic in a moment. But GoPro is an interesting case of it's a product that's very successfully found its niche. It raised huge amounts of capital and got very high valuations on the assumption it could bust out of its niche, and then it never really succeeded. So it's one of those sad stories where it's a great product that people love, but commercially it's kind of a failure. And again, I think this is like, if you raise too much money, you raise the stakes. Just because hardware is more expensive to manufacture doesn't mean that you have got a mass market product, right? You might be in a niche, and you should make sure your cap table and your economics reflect that, or else you can sort of snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And I think that's actually really quite sad for GoPro that happened. Next topic, I thought we could talk a bit about AVs. There are 2 stories that initially I'd had as separate, but I think they dovetail together in interesting ways. So the first is Tesla and their earnings ouch, where basically, they had a fairly big miss on earnings, and they spent a lot of time in that earnings call pointing to the future, the new lower cost EV, but also a lot of discussion about autonomous vehicles and robotaxis and how that is going to be, in a sense, the savior. It's going to add a huge amount of value to Tesla and to the owners of those vehicles and so on, and that's going to increase the value of the company. And actually the share price popped after the announcement. So that was one story. And then the other story I saw was that Ford, which has a hands-free driver assistance, so actually I think more advanced than Tesla's FSD, because you didn't have to have your hands on the steering wheel. And there were a number of crashes, and there was an investigation and said, the investigation found that this hands-free driver assistance was responsible or implicated in a number of these crashes. And I think there's an investigation and it's been suspended and so on. And so I think the through line I wanted to draw here is in terms of AV safety, right? In order for autonomous vehicles to be accepted, do we need them to be as safe as human drivers, or do we need them to be way, way safer? And if it's the latter, what are the implications of that for Tesla and their ambitions?
I don't know how you are going to make something safe enough that a mother with a child is going to feel comfortable handing over control. I don't know how you create that feeling. And maybe it's a generational thing. So maybe you have to start with someone taking over parking, which we have at the moment. I think we've all lost the skill of parking generally, which is great because I didn't have it to begin with. And then you take over other trickier maneuvers potentially. And maybe over time we creep towards full autonomous, fully controlled by someone else. But whenever you get into a situation where 2 cars are going to potentially hit each other and they are connected to each other in the name of prevention, and there's a decision point there, you need to be able to trust that the thing is going to look after you. And I don't know how anyone's ever going to have that trust, particularly with all the narrative around the doomerist culture and things like that. How do we create that trust in something that you'll be willing to put your family in the car?
I guess, I fought this autonomous car battle starting in 2014. So I've been in this for 10 years. And the biggest sort of disagreement between Travis and I and Uber was like the timeline for these things. Part the technology. Everyone's like, oh my God, Moore's Law, this thing is going to be ready in, 2019. And it's so much more complex than Moore's Law. The technology timelines are separate. I actually bet that today per mile, the autonomous vehicles from Cruise and Tesla, etc., are probably safer per mile. But the second thing I disagreed with on timelines is no one wants to be in an accident with a computer. It's just too weird. So it's going to have to be safer before people say, you know what, we want this on our roads and with our kids and all that. But I do think it'll happen because I remember people say, I'll never get in a car with a stranger for Uber. Like, how it's unsafe. Like, what the hell? The drunk driving deaths in cities where Uber is dominant have plummeted big time. The need for parking at airports plummeted big time. Lots of good outcomes. Yes, there's some accidents when an Uber driver gets in an accident. It's a big deal because it's an Uber driver. But net, the safety results are clear. So maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, but it's going to happen. I have a daughter who's 4 years old. I don't know if she'll ever drive, and I'd probably be comfortable with that.
For me, I didn't pass my driving test until I was in my mid-30s. And that was because I lived in cities my entire life. I was really used to public transport. I was used to just getting my own way around. And so learning to drive much later gave me this sense of I never felt this was something I was going to accomplish. It's a tricky skill. And at this point, we feel I can have some empathy with someone who says, oh, it doesn't know how to fold laundry. How's it going to know how to drive a car? And because they're seeing them all as the same thing. And they're not the same thing. They're completely different devices, modalities, representations of things, but everyone has kind of brought them in together as the same thing when they're not. So if we can find ways to make all the other interactions that you have with decision making around AI and so on feel as safe as possible, then that can only be a rising tide that's going to help the autonomous vehicle anyway.
I spoke to a friend of mine who works at Waymo who basically said, yes, internally their feeling is they have to be a lot safer than people. But Emil, you mentioned Uber, and I nearly wonder if what the sector needs is kind of a Travis sort of a person who doesn't give a shit to a certain extent, right? Who's willing to be a bit brazen and say, we have data to show that our things are safer. And yes, they're going to crash sometimes. Yes, people are going to get killed. Yes, that's a tragedy, but that's happening on our roads every day. And so the fact that that happens isn't a reason to stop these things from getting out there. If statistically they're safer, then we should be using them. And someone who's willing to kind of take the heat and just stand up when it happens, and instead of making sort of mealy-mouthed statements about how it's terrible and we're going to suspend the program until we see what happened or whatever, it just is yep, this is an unavoidable part of what it means to be driving on the roads, and we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. If Waymo had the guts to do that under Alphabet, would they be able to bring the regulators along with them ultimately through a bit of a game of regulatory chicken in the way that Uber often did it? Is this really about a lack of courage and a lack of will rather than people's sort of fundamental feelings of, I wouldn't trust a robot to drive this thing? Because, we get into planes every day. And first of all, we're not flying them. The pilot's flying them. But actually, most of the time, the pilot's not flying them. The autopilot's flying them. And no one really seems to have a problem with that. So I wonder if this is actually about a lack of courage from the companies involved in this game.
I don't know, man. Elon's out there. He's pretty courageous. So I think, when the Cruise car had that accident in San Francisco, if you recall, a couple months ago, and there was a big debate as to whether it was the Cruise that messed up or another car hit a pedestrian that then ended up under a Cruise. California suspended the program. Cruise also did because they were a little, and they fired all the execs and they did all the things we're talking about. But I just think the public will have to feel that, and you do need someone to be in the bully pulpit saying that. But I think Elon's pretty much leading the charge on this stuff right now. Ford wouldn't do it, Waymo, whatever. But maybe you're right. Maybe there's some extra years you can get by someone sort of being on the bully pulpit, talking about the benefits loudly and pushing forward in a harder way.
Well, what's the expectation that we think is going to be acceptable? Is it 0? No deaths ever?
We'll never get to 0.
Yeah, of course we can't get to 0. And then we're always going to be waiting for it to go wrong, which is not a helpful piece. So if we can get to a point where there's this education, there's comfort just through generations. To your point, Emil, you have a child who, if she never drives, that's great. As you say, she's probably safer in an AV than she is with any human driver. If you said we all know that the pilot's not flying the plane, but I don't know if we all do know that. I think there's still this understanding coming through of just how little the pilot really does.
Emil, I wanted to ask you about the Uber days because I feel like the analogy is fairly close and maybe I'm missing something. But, you said that when the Cruise crash happened, California suspended the program. And I'm like, did not Uber in the early-ish days with UberX constantly operate in jurisdictions where it was not technically allowed to operate, paid the fines of the drivers, and just kind of, again, played a game of chicken with regulators saying, people like this. This is safe. This is a popular service. Do you really want to ban a popular service based on spurious reasons? And ultimately, Uber won. And I'm like, well, what if Cruise were just like, yes, thank you, California. We're just going to keep operating anyway. And you can fine us if you like and see how things go, right? Why not copy that Uber playbook?
So there was one thing about the Uber playbook that was underappreciated by most, but the people who understood what we were doing really got it. When we launched in a city where we weren't welcomed, let's say, we launched fast and hard. And we made sure people were reliant on Uber to get to the airport for date night. And so by the time the regulators were like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. We had so many fans in that city that they demanded their politicians sort of step back. And it was the ability to create such a useful service very quickly for so many people. And since it was capital light, all we did is sign up drivers and riders, right? It wasn't about like deploying a $70,000 car, which even Google can't do at mass. The sort of political dynamics were different. I think one other interesting angle here might be in China or India, they're building some new city and they design it primarily for driverless cars. And you have an example of something working in a systematic way that might then show the rest of the world that, hey, wait a minute, holy cow, this works. These cars all talk to each other. There's less accidents. There's less traffic. There's less, all the things. But I don't think the Uber tactics work with this kind of thing because of the capital heavy thing.
That's actually a really good point.
Not enough people love it.
I mean, I don't know. You're right about the capital heavy thing, but maybe Waymo, what they could do is they could go to a tier 2, tier 3 city, population of about 1 million people, and they could afford to just blanket that thing in Waymos. But they're not doing that, right? They're expanding very cautiously.
Well, what's interesting is you have this odd political dynamic where the blue states, which are typically regulatory heavy, Arizona and California, are actually allowing the driverless cars to have this back and forth thing. But the red states, which usually are regulation light, are like, no, this is a labor thing. We don't want people to lose their jobs. We don't want fake meat. We don't want all this stuff. So it's sort of just an odd dynamic. You're like, where do you go?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tesla is an interesting one, right? And I wanted to come back to them because you mentioned Elon being brazen, but also you mentioned the capital light Uber model. Now, the only sort of AV company that can replicate that is Tesla because, again, they don't own the vehicles. Someone else owns the vehicles and they can create a service out of them. So it's interesting to me that, what I've seen out of Elon Musk and Tesla for the last few years is a lot of bluster, but they actually haven't done anything super bold in the space. Why haven't they launched a Robotaxi service in the Bay Area? Plenty of Teslas around, that's for sure.
Well, coming August 9th, there's a big announcement from Tesla on Robotaxi, so we'll see what that,
we'll see.
That says.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal. The next big bit of tech news for this week is that the TikTok ban, or so-called TikTok ban, has been passed into law in the US. So what this basically means is TikTok needs to be divested from Chinese ownership in the next 270 days, in the next 9 months, or else it will be banned. So it's not currently banned, but the law is now in place. The clock is now ticking. For their part, TikTok and China have said, no dice, we're not doing this. They've started to take some retaliatory steps, I guess, against US companies. How do we think this will play out?
Well, they've got 269 days to make the capitalist dream come true, right? I don't see how you let all that market value disappear. You have a public, to Emil's point, who love it. If someone loves something, they're going to fight for it. So I'm pretty sure the capitalist structure, the domestic love for this is going to play out, and they'll find a local owner and excise themselves of whatever they think's going on.
Gosh, I did a lot of business in China in a very optimistic time between U.S. and China relations from 2012 through 16. And the potential partnership between the countries was real. Mark Zuckerberg would go there and try to get Facebook sort of launched. WeWork had launched, Uber had launched, Airbnb had launched in China. And that all went away very quickly and dramatically in the last 5 years. So if you're the Chinese Communist Party, which ultimately I think makes this decision, they don't seem to care about money. Look what they're doing to their own companies. Alibaba, Tencent, they're really crushing their national champions. So do they go, well, man, this could be worth $200 billion. We'd like that money in China and part of ByteDance. Or do they go, you know what? Let's cause some domestic unrest in the U.S. Let the young people go bananas. This is a much harder call because it's not just capitalism, because capitalism would dictate the outcome you're talking about, Leah. But this is wrapped up in global trade, sort of brinksmanship and control and so on.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was being slightly reductive in my answer, but what's going to be interesting is whatever China does with this, ByteDance does with this, it's going to be seen as their intentions towards the States. So to your point, if they say, we're going to let it roll, let's see what happens, let's let people fight for their TikTok, that's a statement of intent. And if they choose to divest and realize the value, that's also a statement of intent. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that unfolds, because I reckon a lot of people are going to draw some intent from that. And that's going to start inferring how people interact with the app, but also how they feel about China. Our feelings on it have evolved over the past 5 years. You know, the McDonald's diplomacy piece isn't going to hold for much longer, it feels like. I think it's all going to be about intent and whatever happens from there.
I think, Leah, the first position you articulated, I would say, is kind of the mainstream view amongst the commentariat at the moment, which is like, there's 270 days, there's a lot of money at stake, people love this thing, it'll work itself out. But I kind of agree with Emil, first of all, that this is not really about money. Yes, it's a lot of money, but this is like about superpower geopolitics. So, you know, money's fairly low down the list. And I also agree with you, Leah, that whatever happens is kind of going to be interpreted in that broader way. But there was one other angle I wanted to bring into this, which is, if you were a creator on the TikTok platform, what would you do? And what does that mean for this, right? Because I know what I would do, which is I would spend more of my time investing in Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, because I know that those things are not getting banned. And so I wonder if to a certain extent, this becomes not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but by the time those 9 months roll around, a lot of the value in TikTok has been destroyed. And I guess one thing I'm not sure about, I don't quite understand, is does TikTok, their much vaunted algorithm, like, is their algorithm still that much better than what Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts has? Or is their main advantage at the moment simply that that is where the most content is? And could there be a creator flight to these other platforms that neutralizes that advantage, such that by the time any of this happens in 9 months, people are like, well, TikTok is no longer the dominant short video platform where all the kiddies are?
We need to find a creator to ask. There does seem to be this really well manufactured, this just die hard, do not take this away from me. There seems to be more love for it than you get in like love for Instagram Reels or Threads or whatever Shorts has come out. So I wonder if, to your point, Emil, do they band together and try and actually double down and say, no, this is ours, you're not taking this away, we've made businesses off of here. It's also going to be interesting for the government to work out, how do you take away someone's livelihood, potentially, in that scenario? Like, in the name of national security, are we taking away millions of people's livelihood in the States?
So my prediction is this gets tied up in lawsuits on lawsuits on lawsuits in the U.S., and it just gets kicked down the road, and ultimately it ends up in some compromise where TikTok's allowed to exist. It doesn't have to spin off, but there's some like monitors on how the data is managed and where it goes and that sort of thing. It's just too big a part of people's lives. And there are some the American legal system is not like designed to ban stuff that easily. So there's not like this propaganda can't infiltrate other places. So I think you get to a place where it just gets kicked down the road, and then there's some sort of like, well, we're going to make sure that we look at where the data leakage goes and who's controlling the inputs on the algorithm and blah, blah, blah. That's my guess. It's really hard to take this away from people, and it's really hard to spin it off. It's not that simple. And it's a lot of money to spin off. And this just should be a grand game of chicken. And I just think grand games of chicken end up getting delayed when there's geopolitics involved.
That's what's interesting about the way this law has been set up, which is it is a countdown clock, right? So nothing needs to happen from here on in for the ban to go into effect. The ball's in TikTok's court, which, like you said, they're definitely going to play that ball, and, you know, it's going to go to the Supreme Court and all of that, no doubt. I just think it's interesting in terms of differentiation, because TikTok is not a traditional social network. People don't have a dense social graph there. What TikTok is the place where all the best content is uploaded and a fantastic algorithm for distributing it to the people who find it interesting. And again, if I was a creator, I'd be thinking about hedging my bets. But also, if I were YouTube and Instagram, I would be quite aggressive in sowing that fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? actually going to TikTok creators saying, TikTok's being banned at 9 months. Why don't you come over to us? Let's offer you some incentives, some inducements, a program for the best TikTok creators to come across to YouTube Shorts. I think they could do a lot of damage to TikTok in the next 9 months, just in that environment of uncertainty. And I wonder if, by the time that happens, people won't be as passionate about their TikTok anymore because they'll start migrating to these other places too. But I guess time will tell.
It's an interesting play for Spotify as well. They did a big content bid. It worked well. Daniel has taken a real cut to the business to make it hyper efficient, hyper productive. They had a great earnings, and now he's openly come out and said, we're back on track for growth. We're going to invest in marketing, in growth. If there's a window of opportunity on content to pull content over, it's a completely different business. It's a completely different format. It's a different segment, but there's something interesting here for Spotify, who are ready and raring to spend some money, and potentially a ton of creators that are going to be homeless and want a new place to come and create. So let's see what Spotify does.
Interesting. What I'd love to understand about Spotify is whether they're having any luck with video, because my feeling is they're not. They've done a great job, as you say, Leah, kind of expanding from music to other audio formats, and that they own audio pretty well. But, Spotify does allow you to host video podcasts. And in fact, the Startup Podcast uploads our video to Spotify. But from my analytics, I don't think many of our Spotify listeners are actually watching the video. I know I don't when I'm listening to podcasts. So I think that's going to be their interesting challenge. But I agree that I'm glad you brought them into the mix, because I think they are making a big play for content, and user-generated content makes sense as their sort of next frontier.
Well, look, buying Joe Rogan is a much different thing than having this platform where stuff rises to the top. I get the Joe Rogan thing, and I think it was smart. I don't quite see how they do everyone goes there just to watch cool videos. I think it's more likely to be on Instagram and YouTube. But also, if you're a creator, you just post on all three, don't you? Sure, YouTube says, hey, come do it on YouTube. You're like, I kind of do it already. It just doesn't get that many views.
I mean, definitely you're right. My suspicion as somewhat a creator, although more on the podcast side, but we play in YouTube especially, and a little bit on TikTok, is it's a question of what platform you optimize for, because these are algorithmically boosted platforms, right? If you want to be really successful, yes, you have to create good content, but you need to engage, you need to optimize for whatever the algorithm is doing. You need to stay on top of things. So the question is, okay, at the moment, the TikTok creators are optimizing for TikTok, and they'll upload to YouTube because why not? But they probably don't really care how it performs. Maybe they start caring how it performs on YouTube. They start changing their content and their posting strategy to fit YouTube a bit better. And I think that's really how things maybe start to change.
Going to get kicked down the road, man. We're going to be talking about this in 2026.
Okay, so another bit of news is that the Federal Trade Commission in the US has ended the practice of non-compete clauses in employment contracts. So basically, you can't have a thing that says you can't go work for a competitor anymore. So I think that's big news. It's quite interesting. How do we think this affects employees and the sort of the founder startup space more generally?
I'm not sure how enforced non-competes were in lots of different places, right? So in the UK, in Australia, they've been pretty toothless for a long time. It's been hard to enforce a non-compete that's going to take someone out of the earning environment.
California has already been essentially, you can't do non-competes, which is where Silicon Valley has been. And people attribute actually good things to that it creates this environment of innovation. You're not stuck at some big company. You can go do your own startup, or you could move around, and employees are highly valued and so on. So I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it. Do I think a fast food worker should be subject to a non-compete? No, I think it's absurd. Do I think a tech exec who understands algorithms and can competently contract with their employer and say, I'm essentially getting paid more to agree to a non-compete after? I think the law banning that's kind of silly. And most important of all, and this is where my lawyerness comes out, the FTC absolutely has no authority to do this. There's no chance that some regulatory body has been charged by the US Congress to go invalidate a bunch of contracts. It's insane from a regulatory standpoint. That being said, Congress could pass a law saying, hey, if you're under this salary level, this is crazy. You're not subject to IP. That's really competitive and so on. But the FTC meddling in this stuff is just sort of a worrisome regulatory trend in my view.
I think, first of all, you're right that they're rarely enforced. And in California, they've actually been unenforceable for a long time. I'm not sure if that means they're not in people's contracts, but I think that's the thing. They are used as just a sort of a bullying tactic by employers. It's not the case that they will actually enforce the non-compete, but they will threaten to, and it will be in the contract, and it will basically make it harder for people to leave. I have a friend here in Australia who is an occupational therapist, right? So not in tech. She wanted to start her own business, and her employer tried to stop her on the basis of a non-compete. Not non-solicitation, which is different, right? She wasn't going to take any of her own old clients, but simply to set up business. They were like, we're going to sue you based on the non-compete. She nearly didn't do that because of the threat, even though it was unlikely to be enforceable. So I think in general, it's good to allow people to do what they like with their time and with their labor. To the point of trade secrets, I think, that's interesting. Maybe when you're senior enough, it can be problematic. But I think that's where in investment banking, that's where the old concept of gardening leave came from, which is to say, we use a carrot instead of a stick. Instead of saying, you cannot go and compete, we will pay you for 6 months to sit around and do nothing. That's why it's called gardening leave. It is paid for by the employer that wants to make sure that whatever knowledge you have goes stale before you join your new employer. And I think that is maybe a fairer thing as an employer to say, well, if I want to stop somebody jumping straight to another job, I can do that, but I pay for it. I don't get to just restrict another person's freedom in that way beyond the time when I pay for them.
Yeah, but I don't know if the new FTC rule would agree that the garden leave concept works. They're like, that's non-competitive too.
I mean, if it's by mutual consent, then it's okay, right?
That's the whole point. Mutual consent. At what point do we allow mutual consent by sophisticated parties to do what they want?
Well, it's interesting. And, I think your point is valid, Emil. And in Australia, we have laws around what's called unfair dismissal. So, it's not an at-will employment country. And so if you get fired, you can make a claim for unfair dismissal. But that protection cuts out past a certain salary point where we say, okay, if you are highly paid and senior, then those unfair dismissal protections, which are really important if you're a fast food worker, right? They're no longer so important. And you have significantly fewer rights as a highly paid employee. And I think maybe for non-competes, there's a case to be made that that's how it should be structured.
It seems to be that we've been trying to have our cake and eat it a bit, though, where we don't want someone to go and, quite rightly, don't want them to go and take their knowledge, their experience, and so on, and enrich a competitor directly the day after they leave the business. But we also don't want to pay them. So we can't have it both ways, I think. If we want to pay someone for the privilege of sitting around for 6 months doing gardening leave, and that protects our business, then that's all right. But if we're not willing to do that, then we also don't get to ask them to sit things out for 3 months while we figure out what we're going to do next. Or they have to change careers. Things are getting more niche as well. So if we're asking someone to not stay in their niche, but we're not willing to pay them for the privilege of that, then we don't get to have it both ways. That's the concern, I think. The more pressing question is, what would each of you do with 6 months gardening leave? Because I think I'd enjoy the first day, potentially the first week, and then after that, I think I'd start to go a bit crazy.
I recommend starting a podcast. Okay, we are finishing with the story out of Google. So they had a bunch of protesters against Google's trade with Israel. So it was about the Israel-Gaza situation. And they protested against it. And then they actually occupied the office of, I think it was Thomas Kurian, the CEO of Google Cloud, and demanded that Google end its ties with Israeli companies. Eventually, I believe the police were called in, and all of the employees who were involved in occupying the office were fired. I think one thing that's notable about this that might be worth discussing is this is a change, at least in culture of Google as a representative of some of these companies, where there was a lot of tolerance for dissent of various sorts in the past, where I think the idea of getting fired for strongly expressing your political views at work was not generally what was done. Now, again, these people were not just expressing their political views, they were trespassing, in a sense, in someone else's office. But I think that there has been a bit of a sign of a changing tide of saying, well, work is about work, and it's not the place for sort of large-scale political performance and debate. And, I think Google used to be that place. So this feels like a bit of a watershed moment in that sense.
What were they dismissed for? Do we actually know what the reason was?
I think it was probably more for the occupation of the office, obstructing other people's ability to do their job. I think if they'd said, we believe Google should not be doing business with Israel, that would not have led to a firing, based on my knowledge of that company. Even if they'd done an open letter internally, that still probably wouldn't have crossed a line. But I think in the past, even if things crossed a line, Google would have been cautious about doing a sort of a mass dismissal like this. It definitely was much more of a traditional corporate, like, what the hell do you think you're doing? You're fired sort of thing than they would have done in the past.
I don't know. It's very tricky, this one.
I don't think it's tricky at all. Good riddance. Good riddance. Good riddance. Good riddance. Your primary purpose at work is to do work. If you want to go on your own time and do whatever you want, fine. You can't occupy the office of the president of the cloud, stop him from doing his job, be asked to leave, not leave, and given all the warnings and saying, like, our policy is like, we don't allow this at work. You could complain to your manager, you could at all hands ask about their investment policies, but you can't obstruct in a way that's inconsistent with the business's mission. People need a wake-up call that this is just not okay. Like, sorry, you lose your job. This is not a street corner, it's a business. And so I just think that finally Google's starting to enforce some norms, and I think workplaces generally should be a little bit politics-free, because I actually think you get greater diversity of opinion when you allow people to have like their private lives and their work lives. When people bring their private lives into their work, you cause conflict. And I think this is contrary to the mission. That's my point of view. And I think you're going to see a lot of this kind of thing happen across corporate America and lots of other places, given with all these campus protests we're seeing right now. There was a 23, 24-year-old activist who was speaking at a city council meeting in Bakersfield, California. And she said, I'm going to murder each one of you or something to the 13 council members. And she got charged with 13 counts of terrorism, and she was crying in court. She couldn't believe that you're not allowed to threaten to kill people. And I just think like there's some weird thing. For a while, we were let people say what they want at work and in other places, and there has to be some sort of decorum. So anyway, I hope we're moving back to a little calmer world here.
I largely agree. I think it is important that people have the right to protest and assemble and so on, and that if you in your own time are protesting, that should not affect your employment. I also think, within reason, it's not unhealthy within an organization to allow a certain amount of civil political discussion about, what the company's doing and, whether it's ethical and moral and so on. What I don't think is okay is, first of all, when work becomes effectively like a university campus and it's just people. There were people I knew at Google who spent most of their time just debating stuff on mailing lists to do with politics. I also somewhat agree that it can become a bit of an echo chamber. My politics were pretty well aligned with what most people at Google had, but I can see that if one had opinions that differed from the mainstream there, then you wouldn't feel able to participate comfortably. And the final thing is, if you are not happy with how your employer is doing business and you have tried to change what they do, you've spoken out civilly, internally, and they continue doing business anyway, you are free to take your services elsewhere, right? They are paying you to work for them. And if you don't like what they're doing, then don't take their money. But yeah, you don't get to occupy their offices and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think in this case, there was a clear line that was crossed. And I don't see why Google should feel compelled to continue paying these people to disrupt its own business.
All right. With that,
nice spicy place to end. Emil Michael, Leah Mahtani, thanks so much for joining us for today's episode of the Startup Podcast Reacts.
Thanks.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.